Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event called Partnership with Organizations of Persons with Disabilities, How to Bridge Disability Inclusion and Localization. My name is Rosario Galarza from the International Disability Alliance, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this event. This event is being held in the framework of the Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Weeks 2023. Now I will give the floor to my colleague Yelena from Logistics, who will be doing some housekeeping announcement.
Yelena, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you. My name is Jelena Jezdovic, and I'm going to briefly explain you some of the technical features of today's event. This webinar is being recorded, and there is international sign interpretation, captioning in English and language interpretation in Bahasa, Romanian, and Ukrainian. A CC button on the bottom of your screen in the meeting control bar will enable the closed captions, and if you need captions in the external window, the link will be in the chat box. The interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, presented as a globe, will allow you to access specific language channels. Please choose your channel that you will follow throughout the whole meeting. The participants do not have an option of opening the microphone and video. Should you have any question as attendee, kindly leave them in Q&A section. Our team is monitoring the chat box and will try to respond to questions during the event where possible. Should you have any accessibility issues, please send a private message to the host account. We request all speakers to kindly keep the times and keep their cameras off if not speaking. We are asking you that you speak slow enough for the interpreters and captioners to follow. Thank you all and have a good event.
Thank you so much, Yelena, for this important announcement. Welcome again to this event, which is organized by Reference Group on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities and Humanitarian Action, DRG. The DRG was established in Humanitarian Network Partnership Weeks at 2020, following the launch of the IS Guidelines on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action. The group has now grown to over 300 members, including organizations of persons with disabilities, OPDs, NGOs, and UN entities working together to advance disability inclusive humanitarian action. Local organizations of persons with disabilities are an important reference point to ensure effectiveness and acceptability of humanitarian action. However, collaboration between these organizations and humanitarian actors may face some challenges. In this event, humanitarian actors and local OPDs will share their perspectives on collaboration based on successful and more difficult experiences. During this event, panelists will discuss some practical tips and lessons learned on how to ensure equal and meaningful partnerships with OPDs to strengthen localization and disability inclusion. We will have the pleasure to have great panelists today, such as Karen Johans from USAID, who will be speaking regarding disability inclusion and localization. We also have Philemon Madwat from UNICEF, who will discuss about the efforts to contribute to support participation between OPDs and humanitarian actors. We have Tali Abad from AIDA, who will discuss about the role of funding, promoting participation of OPDs. And we have my colleague Amba Salelkar from IDA, who will be speaking about experience of Bridge Article 11 in bridging collaborations between mainstream humanitarian actors and OPDs. And finally, we will have country examples. And we will have speakers from Ukraine and Indonesia. Now, in order to start this event, I will pass the floor to Karen Johans from USAID and Bureau and Humanitarian Assistance, who will be speaking about the opening remarks regarding disability inclusion and localization, reflections from current practice. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rosario. Good morning, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C., and thank you all for the opportunity to join you today. Thank you to the Disability Reference Group for hosting and coordinating this event, and in doing so, drawing attention to the critical role of organizations of persons with disabilities, OPDs, in humanitarian action. Thank you also to the distinguished panelists for sharing your insights and expertise on this topic. We are looking forward to hearing your remarks and learning from you today. My name is Karen Johannes, and I serve as a Gender, Age, and Social Inclusion Advisor in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA. This is the humanitarian funding and coordination arm of the U.S. government. At BHA, we recognize that there is a unique impact of conflict and crisis on persons with disabilities, and we work to promote disability inclusion in our humanitarian assistance and disaster response efforts. Towards this end, we have been proud to partner with the Disability Reference Group over the last 2 years and support some of their efforts on implementation of the IASC guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. Disability inclusion is a critical pillar for effective humanitarian responses, and the leadership of OPDs must also be recognized as a critical pillar of localization, which includes a commitment to empowering and elevating the voices of affected communities and ensuring the needs, capacities, and interests of persons with disabilities are at the center of all humanitarian programming. Through the advocacy and leadership of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations over the last decades, there has been tremendous progress in developing approaches and standards for disability-inclusive humanitarian action. Yet persons with disabilities still face exclusion from consistent opportunities to lead and influence formal humanitarian decision-making structures at global and local levels. We are here today because we all see the need for concerted efforts to improve the status quo. Persons with disabilities and OPDs should be at the forefront of humanitarian efforts. OPDs provide a vital link between humanitarian response efforts and persons with disabilities. Not only do OPDs have nuanced knowledge of cultural contexts, political dynamics, and community support networks, they typically have greater access to affected populations. OPDs are among the first to respond to crises, remaining in the communities they serve before, during, and after emergencies. Recent humanitarian crises, including the displacement caused by Russia's war in Ukraine, which we'll talk about more today, and the complex, protracted humanitarian emergencies in the Horn of Africa, have highlighted how critical it is that organizations of and for persons with disabilities have the resources and opportunities to influence humanitarian leadership and decision-making. Let me close here by saying that one of the keys to localization is to shift power from traditional donors like BHA and large international organizations to conflict and disaster-affected populations. This requires intentional action to change social norms, confront ableism, and dare to change business as usual so that we may create more inclusive, quality, responsive, and rights-based humanitarian action and structures. Today's discussion will highlight promising examples of action towards this objective, as well as real challenges we will confront along the way. Thank you again for the opportunity to join you all for this discussion, and back to you, Rosario.
Thank you so much, Karen, for these opening remarks, discussing about the evolution of disability inclusive humanitarian action in a global and local level. Now I will pass the floor to Philemon Macbeth from UNICEF, who will be addressing how can the current localization efforts contribute to support a stronger participation between OPDs and humanitarian actors. Philemon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rosaria, and thank you very much, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, depending from where you are joining from. My name is Philemon Majua. I work for UNICEF as the Humanitarian Policy Specialist, and I'm currently leading on the work on localization. I would want to share with you some thoughts on how we are advancing the interagency work around localization. So I'll be specifically talking about two mechanisms. So one, the IAC process, and also other interagency mechanism, for example, the grant bargaining initiative. So as many of you are aware, the IAC activated the task force. There are 5 task forces that were initiated last year. And they were the task force on one, the centrality of protection. There is also the task force on accountability to affected population. There's a task force on preserving humanitarian space, a task force on humanitarian development collaboration, and the last one is the task force on localization. And for the localization task force, the most interesting thing, or the main thing that has been tasked with that task force, is to enable the meaningful participation, engagement, and leadership of local and national actors, with specific focus on women-led organization in humanitarian response, enhancing capacity exchange, and increasing the direct funding to local actors. Now, with this objective, the task force now prioritized 3 working areas. So there is the first priority where the focus is to strengthen the engagement and leadership of local and national actors in humanitarian coordination mechanism and humanitarian response. This is a critical piece that we feel that the local OPDs have also the need or an upper hand to kind of engage in this coordination mechanism. The next priority area is to agree on arrangement to strengthen the sharing of capacity between international actors and local NGOs, including local actors. As my colleague has said, that local actors do have first-hand information during response. So it is critical for us to think, how do we really want to complement capacities, including sharing capacities between international actors and, for this instance, local OPDs? How do we recognize and ensure that local OPDs are engaged appropriately in humanitarian response and also preparedness action? The last priority area for the task force is to support efforts to increase and channel more direct funding to local NGOs. And this includes also local OPDs. I would want to share some thoughts in terms of some tools that IAC has developed. And I want to kind of focus on the guidance note on participation of local actors in IAC coordination mechanism. This is a critical piece that would really advance the participation of local actors in IAC coordination mechanism, and to help us in terms of trying to shift the power of the coordination of humanitarian mechanism to the local actors. So they are around, I won't go through everything, but what I want to share is some commitments that IAC has made in terms of participation and representation. As of today, the system is tracking how the percentage of members of coordination bodies at the country level. And there are 2 ways that it is being tracked. One, there is the globally tracked indicator, and there's the nationally or locally tracked indicator. Now, for the local OPDs, we do have a commitment that we are supposed to ensure that the percentage of members of coordination bodies at the country level at least include representation from women-led organizations or from OPDs and other diverse groups. I think these are very critical commitments by the system to ensure that we really not kind of just have some of these commitments on paper, but by tracking them, we really kind of operationalize and ensure that local actors, including local OPDs, take up leadership of coordination mechanism. The other piece that I would want to share is the one that was endorsed early in the year in terms of the advancing of overhead costs to local actors. This is critical because for once we really do have a system commitment in terms of ensuring that overhead costs for local actors, including local OPDs, are included in the humanitarian program or the proposals that are being funded by donors or the ones that are being funded through international organizations. And then lastly, that I want to share briefly is the work that is going on at other interagency frameworks, so particularly the grant bargain process. So the grant bargain process, there has been 3 and now 4 outcome documents that are really important in terms of advancing the localization agenda. There was an outcome that was focusing on the role of the intermediaries, and here the intermediary refer to both national and international organizations that do have some elements of partnering with local actors. There was a commitment that we're supposed to ensure flexible and multi-year funding to local actors. And then the latest outcome that is under negotiation is the outcome on the 25% funding to local actors, including, in this case, OPDs. So in summary, I think we already do have very strong commitments through the IAC and other global initiatives or frameworks. And what we need to now focus on is how to operationalize and realize some of these commitments. Thank you very much, colleagues, and I look forward to participating in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philemon, for explaining about especially this IAC coordination mechanism and the commitments. And now to continue with the event, I will pass the floor to one of my colleagues from International Disability Alliance, Talin Avares. And she will be speaking about the role of funding, promoting participation and collaboration with OPDs, key messages arising from the GLAD Disability and Localization report. Talin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rosario, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Firstly, thank you to the DRG for inviting me to provide an overview of funding as promoting participation and collaboration with OPD. So my presentation will be focused on sharing some of the key messages that arose from a study that we did on disability and localization, and then our plans for a future study. As Rosario mentioned, my name is Talin Avares, and I manage the GLAD network. So you may be asking what the GLAD network is. You may have heard of it before. So as a reminder, we are a coordination body of bilateral and multilateral donors and agencies, foundations, private sector and OPDs, working to enhance the inclusion of persons with disabilities in international development and humanitarian action. The network was launched in 2015 by a group of partners who recognized that the international community really needs to come together, particularly the donors, to share expertise, coordinate actions, and really elevate the profile of disability across a broad range of organizations who are already contributing resources to international development efforts. So we launched the network in 2015. We are up to about 45 members as a network, including a number of states, but also a lot of multilateral donors, so UN agencies, foundations, etc. And the network itself is global, so we have members from all over the world, and it covers a broad range of topics and expertise as well. Some of our key kind of goals that we work on, we use the network as a mechanism from learning from each other by sharing the good practices and knowledge and resources. We use the network members to really amplify the voices of persons with disabilities. So the International Disability Alliance is a permanent co-chair of the GLAD network, meaning that we always have that strong OPD thread in the work that we do. And because of the high profile ness of our members, we can expedite advocacy objectives that the international disability rights movement may have. So we really use Article 32 of the CRPD as kind of our main focused on international development and working with a broad range of organizations. So the reason I wanted to provide this background is because in 2019, the network itself recognized the importance of investing in OPDs to ensure that OPDs can develop skills, capacity, and influence and act as meaningful development partners. So in a bid to do this, we reviewed existing mechanisms and we wanted to identify the need for the donor community to do more to build the capacities of OPDs. With that in mind, we commissioned development initiatives to conduct a study to assess meaningful investments in OPDs. So we wanted to look at 3 countries in particular, to look at how donors worked in those countries, what were the dynamics, the quality of funding, the quality of capacity building support, and OPD participation. So first of all, we used IATI, the International Aid and Transparency Initiative, to find out that indeed most of our members made up the vast majority of disability inclusion investments, with a focus that there was kind of a disproportionate sectoral focus on the health sector when it comes to those funding lines. So we took a strong OPD perspective when we did these studies and balanced it also with interviews with donors and delivery intermediaries. So we spoke to about 67 respondents. Of those, 45 were OPD. So it was a really strong OPD focused study. Obviously, we wanted to support from donors, so that's why we had a number of GLAD donors involved in the study as well. Some of the key findings was that the donors tend to fund INGO intermediaries, which then channel the funding to OPDs who are engaged in the delivery of the projects. One common theme was the focus on building institutional capacities, which would allow OPDs to build their capacities for long-term project implementation. And the good news is that some donors are making a deliberate effort to move towards the localization, to move the localization agenda forward. So what that means is donors demand an approach, a partnership approach between intermediaries and any funding partners to work collaboratively with OPDs from the very beginning to ensure that the participation is done in a meaningful manner to improve inclusiveness of projects. We even found some good trends from donors that they demand a local leadership strategy to kind of shift the powers and sustainability of the projects, even by the end of the program and beyond that. So in continuing these studies and knowing the ongoing humanitarian crises, and with a global spotlight on the response mechanisms, particularly those that are responding to persons with disabilities, it's even more important that we look further at these systems to review access to funding and then the partnerships between the humanitarian actors and agencies and the participation of OPDs. So for this reason, the GLAD network will be doing a second study, which we are starting this year, and situational analysis to kind of access to humanitarian funding and partnerships with OPDs. So we want to look at review access to funding, the partnerships between humanitarian actors and agencies, and then the participation of OPDs to see when the calls for proposals are made, how accessible are they to OPDs? Does it include language in there about disability rights organizations, etc.? So we will be mapping donor investments by humanitarian agencies, including earmarked funding that it's included with OPDs. And then we'll be looking at which OPDs are selected, how they are selected, how the funding then trickles down to the OPDs on the ground, the funding priorities, the duration, the amount, etc. So quite a few items that we'll be looking at. And they will be looking at the nature of collaboration and dialogue between those donors, the humanitarian agencies, and the OPDs. So we're focused on 3 cases, being the floods in Pakistan, the war in Ukraine, and then the refugee and displacement in Jordan. So we'll be starting those studies soon, and we wanted to share this with you now as kind of the information that this will be happening. OPDs on the ground in those countries will be contacted to kind of to scope out their experiences. We'll also be speaking with donors that are working in those 3 countries to really find out what's happening on the ground, to identify those good practices and also identify the gaps there as well. If you have any questions, I'll put my email in the chat box, and thank you very much, Rosario. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Tallene. Thank you so much, especially for providing the outcomes of the study and for emphasizing how important it is to invest in the capacity building of OPDs to advance in disability inclusive humanitarian action. Before our next speaker, I would like to remind you that we will have a session of questions and answers after all the panelists are done. And in order to do that, I would like to invite you to post your questions in the chat box. Okay, now I would like to invite one of my colleagues from International Disability Alliance, especially from the Capacity Building Unit, Amba Salelka from the Bridge team. She will be addressing the topic of bridging collaborations between mainstream humanitarian actors and OPDs, the experiences around Bridge Article 11. Please, Amba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And we'd also like to welcome everyone to the Humanitarian Networks and Partnership Week. We understand that this is starting today, and we hope that things that we talk about will carry with all of the attendees for the next few days. As Rosario said, my name is Amba. I am the Capacity Building Senior Technical Advisor at the International Disability Alliance. And I live in Chennai in India, which is where I'm joining you from. It is my pleasure to speak to you all about how Bridge Article 11, or Bridge Module 3, as we call it, has fostered collaborations between mainstream humanitarian actors and organizations of persons with disabilities, or OPDs. The Bridge CRPD SDGs training initiative was piloted in 2015. And this was it was developed to enable the participation of organizations of persons with disabilities in the development agenda. Now, some of you may know that the Agenda 2030 was quite heavily negotiated, and there was a huge participation of OPDs that wanted to address the fact that its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, actually had no mention of disability. And in this upcoming agenda, it was really important to press for the participation of persons with disabilities and recognition in the goals as well. So in 2015, the Bridge initiative was piloted. Bridge has 2 modules. So Bridge is a training initiative which is developed by organizations of persons with disabilities for organizations of persons with disabilities. There are 2 modules. Initially, the first was focused on the what. What is the jurisprudence of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? What is the Agenda 2030? What are the linkages between them? And module 2 was more focused on the how. So how do we connect the CRPD and the SDGs? How do we leverage public policies towards CRPD compliance? How do we engage with stakeholders? Now, as Bridge was taking off, we have other developments happening in parallel. So, for example, the Sendai framework. So following the adoption of the Sendai framework, you have the launch of the Charter on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action. And besides this as well, there have been significant movements towards addressing this issue of the inclusion of persons with disabilities in situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. And Bridge alumni, so people who went through Bridge 1 or Bridge 2, actually were heavily involved in the consultations around the Humanitarian Charter. At the same time, there were programmatic interventions also being developed. So there was a consortium project called Inclusive Humanitarian Action for Persons with Disabilities, which involved IDA as well as HI and CBM International. And one of the expected results from this was the establishing of a capacity building mechanism to foster the cooperation between OPDs, humanitarian actors, and local stakeholders. And because Bridge had just been in development, it had been piloted, and it was very, very well received by IDA as well as IDDC members, IDDC being the International Disability and Development Consortium. It was looked upon as a model that could take this forward. So like we linked the CRPD and the SDGs, how could we link the CRPD SDGs and the emerging humanitarian tools which existed? So accordingly, the first global bridge, CRPD SDGs Module 3, which was focused on Article 11, was organized between 2018 and 2019. One of the things that Module 3 does that the first two modules of Bridge does not do is that it opens applications from humanitarian actors. So 1/3 of the participants are from humanitarian organizations. So for the Global Bridge, which took place ultimately in 2019 in Lebanon, we received 120 applications. 72 were from Bridge alumni, but 48 were from humanitarian actors. And this followed a very extensive selection process in which you looked at, of course, representing the diversity of the disability movement, which is something we always do in Bridge, but also looking at a variety of stakeholders from the humanitarian actors. So for example, balancing geographical locations, where people, you had different positions, some were field workers, some were senior, people working at the regional level, at the national level, and so on. So it was important for the task team of this Bridge Module 3, which is the body that kind of looks at maintaining the quality and purpose of the Bridge training, looked for people who could work in synergy with OPDs at the country level so that they could support each other to reach out for a better impact. In 2020, January, we organized a review of the Bridge Article 11, and this involved IDA members, but also members of IDDC and other stakeholders. The first Bridge Module 3, was organized by IDA and IDDC, but also CBM, DPOD, HI, and was funded from DFAT, Finland, as well as from the European Union, and under a project called Bridging the Gap. So different stakeholders came together to do a review, and it was found that even though it had just been about 6 months since the training had taken place, many alumni were reporting that they had positive experiences at the country level. And in fact, it was quite timely because, as we all know, very shortly after this, we were all seized with a global pandemic that was a true test of all of the humanitarian mechanisms that we had. And we found that alumni, OPDs, as well as humanitarian actors kept the lessons and kept the momentum going from that training as best as they could. Still in 2020, the Reference Group on Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities in Humanitarian Action, or the DRG, was established as a platform which creates cooperation between agencies, including the UN, NGOs, and OPDs, on disability inclusive humanitarian response. And one of the mandate is the dissemination and implementation of key guidance materials like the IASC guidelines. In 2021, a project around capacity building of OPDs and strengthening inclusive humanitarian action was proposed by UNICEF on behalf of the DRG co-chairs to USAID. And this was again centered around capacity building as one of the 4 interventions. And once again, the project coordination group looked at the bridge module 3 as something which was replicable and which could be, the methodology and materials could be developed again, could be, refreshed and given to an audience. So we will be having, in fact, next week, a module in South Asia, which is for OPDs and humanitarian actors from Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Pacific. Once again, we had over 100 applications for this, and it's been a really amazing response. Later this year, we will have cycles in the MENA region and in West Africa, particularly French-speaking countries in West Africa. In West Africa, it will be focused on complex emergencies. In MENA, it will be on conflict. And the upcoming in Kathmandu, which is happening next week, is focused on natural hazards. So we look forward to this, building this community of practice around inclusive humanitarian action among OPDs, as well as among humanitarians, and seeing what these collaborations will look like and how we can take forward the work that they're doing at the national and regional levels. So thank you very much. I will hand back to Rosario and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amba, for explaining the process of bridge and what the experiences of bridge Article 11 have impact in the disability in inclusive humanitarian action. And now we are going to move to the country examples. But before that, I would like you to make sure to enable the interpretation, English interpretation, because now we are going to switch languages first to Ukrainian, and then to Bahasa. Now I would like to invite person from Ukraine for the topic War in Ukraine, OPDs and humanitarian actors collaboration in the response. I don't know if we have now Vitaly Mester or not, please.
Yes, we do, Rosario.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, I would like to invite first Vitaly Mester, Executive Director of the Moldova Center for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CDPD.
Bună ziua, mă numesc Vitaly Mester, sunt director executiv.
Hello, my name is Vitalia Mester. I am an executive director for the Center for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in the Republic of Moldova. I am honored to speak to you about our experience with respect to Moldova's response to the humanitarian crisis and our collaboration with our development partners that gave us their support during these war times to support the Ukrainian refugees and people with disabilities, persons with disabilities. We, as an organization in the Republic of Moldova, gave our help to help refugees that came to the Republic of Moldova because of the war, either to live on the territory of the Republic of Moldova or as people transiting the Republic of Moldova to go towards EU member states. The organization I represent has been set up in 2006, and we are a leader organization among OPDs. We are promoting and defending the rights of persons with disabilities. Since the beginning of the war, 24th of February 2022, our organization has been actively involved in a response to the humanitarian crisis. To mention a few of the challenges we were faced with: inaccessible transportation for persons with disabilities, lack of housing or temporary refugee centers because they do not correspond to standards for ensuring minimal conditions for decent living for persons with disabilities. Another challenge is the approach. We have seen to this issue. We don't have an inclusive approach. Many a times, public authorities and the representatives of humanitarian agencies do not differentiate between OPDs or organizations of service providers. Generally, these service providers are strong organizations. They know how to write projects, how to put them on paper, and how to represent their interests. And the Moldavian authorities or NGOs do not take into account the expertise OPDs might have when dealing with persons with disabilities. The experts coming to the Republic of Moldova, experts in the field of humanitarian actions, teach OPDs about inclusiveness, but do not focus on the needs of persons with disabilities or on capacity building for OPDs to answer this humanitarian crisis. As of 2022 and during this year, during 2023, we had great support from IDA. Our organization has become an associated member of the European Forum for Persons with Disabilities. And we trust we can start to change things around. My recommendations for those that come with financial support to the Republic of Moldova to finance the humanitarian field and humanitarian actions. If they want to truly support OPDs in their answers to the humanitarian crisis, they should take into consideration the capacity of the local organizations when working with persons with disabilities, because we can speak from our own experience. We persons with disabilities have our own life experience. We have first-hand experience on many things, and we would like partners who come to Moldova with support and financing possibilities to ensure the participation of OPDs and of persons with disabilities to their actions. They should ensure the participation of persons with disabilities in all levels, at all levels, because generally they only stop at informing. persons with disabilities. They do not move further to more progressive stages, such as involving persons with disabilities in various activities, empowering persons with disabilities in order to act for themselves. And they are rarely involved in the monitoring process or assessment of progress. For us, it is important to provide a good response to all crisis situations. I am very glad for having received an invitation to attend your event. The Republic of Moldova is here represented by me, and I will gladly answer all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vitaly, especially to provide these remarks about how important it is to invest in capacity building for OPDs to respond properly to the humanitarian crisis, and also how important it is to ensure meaningful and active participation in all levels of OPDs. And I would like to pass the floor to Larissa Baida. Larissa Baida is project coordinator of the National Assembly of Persons with Disabilities in Ukraine. Larissa, the floor is yours.
Доброго дня. Good morning, everybody. I am representing the National Assembly of the People with Disabilities. It's more than 100 organizations which indeed were created and are managed by the people with disabilities. We have got unique experience from the beginning of the war. We have assembled quite a lot of knowledge, and we can talk whether the standards of humanitarian assistance are indeed working during the war, because they were developed before the war and they're being developed now. We are also talking about the participation of the people with disabilities in the decision-making processes, especially when we are talking about the humanitarian assistance. And when we are talking about the processes of rebuilding of Ukraine, which we are discussing now, we are talking about this from the very first days of the war. Why is this important? I'll be very honest with you. In the first months of the war, the first humanitarian donors and players in the humanitarian field in practice did not support the NGOs or for the people with disabilities. And it was the European Forum of Disabilities and international associations of the people with disabilities across the world. We managed to survive and indeed to provide humanitarian assistance to the people with disabilities and the elderly. We had a lot of challenges, and I'm sure you know that apart from the war, we have got another massive indeed challenge. Now we have got a number of villages and towns which have been flooded. So those who were hiding in these shelters, they now have to evacuate because all their villages are covered in water. So in Ukraine, we have got two situations, two massive challenges. We are talking about the critical situation and indeed about the experience we managed to gain, especially the experience for the NGOs, for the people with disabilities. Well, talking about this, we can say we've done a lot of research. We are talking about the funding, the preparation for assistance, humanitarian assistance, the international players in the humanitarian field and humanitarian development, including the UN agencies, have heard us. And for quite a number of months, we are having a big decision-making process, big change in providing the assistance, humanitarian assistance to the elderly and people with disabilities in Ukraine. The meeting will take place tomorrow. different agencies, and we are thrilled about this because it will give us a perspective and hopefully the improvement. But I would like to share the practical experience we have and lessons learned from the beginning of the war. From the very beginning, I would like to say that the humanitarian assistance was not inclusive if we talk about the people with disabilities that are concerned the hygiene, finances, and also the food bags. When we talk about the food bags, it's more about the access to assistance for those who have disabilities, access to information, because a significant number of people with deafness or people with blindness even now can't get the information so that they could get the assistance, which is important for them. And yes, it is of our concern. When we talk about it to the international players, we always say to them, you have to give the information about your assistance in the accessible form. I'm not sure we are heard. Every country has, let's say, specific requirements. When in Ukraine, we have the first, the second, third group of people with disabilities. Indeed, the first group has the hardest difficulties. And sometimes we hear the announcement that the humanitarian assistance will be given to people age 70 plus of the first group of disability in the live queue. That is impossible because there are people who would never walk or get to the queue. They are at home, they're in bed, they're bedridden. So the information about the humanitarian assistance has to be of the necessary level. And that means that the understanding of disability is different when we talk about the donors of humanitarian assistance. We have got quite a lot of advisors on inclusivity in various organizations, but we feel they don't always understand the full scope of the problems of people with disability. We also noticed that the clusters which work in Ukraine at the moment do not have enough coordination. And sometimes for months, we can't get to a particular cluster, particular working group so that they could get us heard, so that we could talk about our challenges. Also, quite often when we are told that it's rapid response. For us, rapid response is a week or maximum a month. But here we are talking about the rapid response which can happen in 6 months or in a year. The situation in Ukraine is challenging and is changing very quickly. And if we are talking about the support of the local organizations, we need to understand that the finances and the capacities have to be geared towards that, because we do hope that this war will end one day and we won't need so much humanitarian assistance and support, which is now given to Ukraine. But people who are working in the NGOs, in the organizations for people with disabilities, they have to understand that they have enough human resources, financial resources, and start rebuilding Ukraine. We also can say that today we have a serious challenge of the flexibility of approach to the humanitarian assistance. We can give you a lot of examples when indeed certain stereotypes are taking place. We can talk about the logistics of humanitarian assistance, what the previous speakers have mentioned, when the resources of the local organizations, financial resources, are not taken into account. For example, we are offered the food support or hygiene, and we have to collect this, and it will take 100 kilometers. And for us, for small local organizations, to get the petrol, to get to this, it's impossible. It's too expensive and too costly. So we need to have this to support these local organizations as well. Otherwise, it is very difficult. One more thing I wanted to mention, and that is that in Ukraine, as I've said, the situation changes very quickly, and certain things like planning, long-term planning in the humanitarian assistance, financial assistance might not always work. I gave you an example today that we had a situation when we have the war and also we've got flooding at the same time. So we need this flexibility when we talk about the evacuation of the people with disabilities and elderly people, also how we give out the food packages, etc. Another thing which is very important for us, whether the humanitarian assistance should be spread to all the people with disabilities or just the internally displaced people with disability. People in Ukraine, everybody is living below the poverty level. The pension is $50 a month. And now when we work with local groups of people with disability, we know that especially in the villages, people who live there haven't received the financial assistance or food assistance from donors even once. That is a very serious question. And if the donors could hear us, hopefully they will, is that humanitarian assistance should include every person with disability and not just internally displaced ones. And also for the end, I wanted to say that the monitoring of the situation in giving humanitarian assistance should indeed be placed as one of the priorities, because without this, we cannot understand whether there are new challenges, whether there are new barriers. Or I'll give you an example that even for now, we cannot get the statistics from the donors and those who provide humanitarian assistance. We don't know how many people were covered, or statistics is very important. We have to collect it. We have to assess, indeed, how many people with disability were given this assistance. When we're talking about the age groups, we're talking about the gender. But thank you very much for the possibility to speak, and I'll be ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this speech to talk about the current situation in Ukraine, and how important it is to promote participation of persons with disabilities, especially in decision-making process. Now I'd like to invite our colleagues from Indonesia. We're going to switch from Ukrainian to Bahasa now. And they are going to talk about Partners for Inclusion, Localizing Humanitarian Response, Pioneer Dot and ILRI Innovation Grants. And now I would like to invite Husna Juni Ulansari from ASB Indonesia. Please, Husna, the floor is yours.
Please allow me to share my screen. Hold on a sec. I hope everyone can see my screen now. Good evening, everyone. I'm Husna from ASB Indonesia in the Philippines. ASB is a humanitarian organization working for inclusive humanitarian preparedness and response. Today, I'm here with Sidik. Sidik is the member of working group of OPDs from Central Sulawesi, Indonesia. And we are here to share our learning and experience from Pioneer. So Pioneer is a partnership project that localized inclusive humanitarian response in 2 districts in Indonesia, and it was funded by ELRA in 2021 until 2022. So based on our experience, there are 3 essential things we should ensure to strengthen the collaboration between local OPDs and humanitarian actors. These are the collaborative and equal partnership, capacity enhancement, and ensuring meaningful participation or participation revolution. Let's discuss this one by one. So the first one is building a collaborative and equal partnership. How can we do this? Building an equal partnership means that we shift the power to the local OPDs so that they can access the necessary resources, including financial resources, and they can have control over the decision-making process throughout all stages of humanitarian actions, starting from the design until the evaluation phase. We can do this by, for example, creating a code of conduct for the partnership, creating a coordination mechanism, and also role division for task sharing among partners to strengthen the sense of ownership, trust, and also accountability. Shifting the power to the local OPDs has been proven to lead to a greater level of participation in this case, because to some extent, it also disrupts the paternalistic power relations between OPDs and humanitarian organizations. Second, we have to remember that not all local OPDs already have the organizational capacity in project management and humanitarian interventions. That's why we should consult with them and work together with them to facilitate knowledge sharing between local OPDs and humanitarian practitioners. We can conduct training on relevant topics, such as accessibility assessment, localization of aid, and also project management cycle and data collection in humanitarian actions. Last but not least, we have to ensure the meaningful participation of local OPDs by removing their barriers to participation, including physical barriers and communication barriers. This can be done by providing accessibility and reasonable accommodation in all activities. For example, by providing accessible training materials and accessible training methods. It is equally important for humanitarian organizations to provide financial resources, for example, by giving grant to the local OPDs to lead and manage their own humanitarian interventions at the local level. But in order for us to create a more sustainable participation in the future, it is worth noting that we should also support the advocacy of local OPDs to influence the policymaking process so that they could gain support from the local government to continue their inclusive actions at the local level, even after the humanitarian organizations or INGOs have already withdrawn from the project location. Pioneer has tried to fulfill all those three aspects, but in reality, there were some challenges that we faced, and these challenges are also pretty common in other local humanitarian interventions in Indonesia. Now, let's hear more about these challenges from my colleague, Sidik. Sidik is a member of OPDs in Central Sulawesi, and he was an active partner and contributor in Pioneer Project. Pak Sidik, the floor is yours.
Suara saya cukup
Hello,
jelas.
can you hear me clearly? So with regards to the topic of challenges, there are indeed several matters that we have concluded, and this was from the localization of the humanitarian actions. Firstly, what we often found is that oftentimes organizations, in this case humanitarian agencies, tend to assume that OPDs at the local level have met the requirements to be able to be involved in a humanitarian program. And this is done by meeting the administrative requirements. For example, having a work program, having an organization structure, and so on. Therefore, what we find is that the OPDs at the local level oftentimes tend to then become a follower, or they are only representing the involvement of the persons with disabilities or PWDs in the humanitarian programs. This is more or less similar with feeding or just giving a fish without giving a fishing rod. This is a mindset that we need to change. And next is about the capacity of the OPDs. We find that there is a gap between the capacity of OPDs at the local level with those at the national and the global level, especially with regards to the technical capacity. For example, familiarity with technology, operating Microsoft Office, using a computer, preparing budgets, designing proposals, and so on. And as such, we do need to provide capacity building for them as well. This is a specific need. By doing so, we hope that they can then participate fully in these programs. Moreover, in the humanitarian programs that have been jointly designed with various organizations and humanitarian agencies. Considering the challenges that I have just discussed, a question often then comes to mind. Are humanitarian agencies ready? Are they ready to invest? Especially for capacity building and the development of human resources for the OPDs at the local level. Apologies, we are currently experiencing slightly unclear audio. Interpretation will be adjusted to what the interpreter can render. In this case, we need to also increase the resilience and also the independence. So I think this is more or less all from my side. Thank you very much, and I would welcome any questions. If you have any questions, please feel free. I would be happy to respond them. And back to you, Rosario, as the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Husna and Sidek for this important contribution, this example of collaboration between humanitarian actors and OPDs, and to emphasize about the importance of removing barriers and providing reasonable accommodation. And now we are going to move to our Q&A session, sorry. I don't know if Christian, you can help me or someone can help me with that, with the questions in the chat box.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rosario. And hello, everyone. So I'm Christian Modino. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Disability Reference Group. Thank all of you for participating, and thanks a lot to all the panelists. I mean, we have heard very powerful messages, particularly from the speakers talking about the country examples in the Ukraine war response and in Indonesia. We've received a few questions, Rosario, so I'm going to put one, which I found quite interesting. So it's a question to all panelists, but maybe we can appoint a couple to answer this one. So one is, what advice would you give for partnering between humanitarian organizations and local OPDs in resource and funds limited settings? So maybe for this one, would be good probably to hear from our Ukraine colleague to see if you have any particular question or response based on your experience in the Ukraine context.
Yes, we have some recommendations for all participants, for all actors involved in Ukraine. First of all, in terms of improvement of clusters function, because as soon as the military action started, we also started actively collaborating with them. And now we actually see that their operations are not very effective, and the capacities they were supposed to provide in Ukraine, they're still limited. Tomorrow we'll participate in this big event, meeting, where we'll discuss the coordination of clusters work and the improvement, because the resources are limited there, and Ukraine has to make use of them in a smart way. The second thing we'll be discussing, getting experts, consultants involved representing the OPDs on different aspects. I already mentioned that it will save the resources. I will give you just one example. In Ukraine, we built modular towns. These are funding. This is funding coming from international donors. These modular towns and settlements are not accessible for people with disabilities or elderly people. These are wasted resources, wasted funds, while this service is not accessible for people with disabilities. Now we renovate, rebuild hospitals and nurseries. They rebuilt a hospital, but this hospital remains inaccessible. All they purchase equipment, infrastructure, or facilities, which we are people with in disabilities are not able to use. If OPDs would get involved in planning for this funding, that would be a great thing. The third thing we paid attention to, this is institutional support for institutional capacities for people with the disabilities. It's extremely important. Our colleagues, panelists, already talked about that today. There's saying that national organizations serve as the providers, the sub-providers. We are invited at the lowest, latest stage, and the decisions are quite often taken instead of us. And it's thus very important for us, for all of us in all our countries, as recommended by the CRPD committee, for our organizations, for status of our organizations to be accepted and recognized, because the organizations working for the sake of people with disabilities, they do a lot, but they do not really understand the full extent of the situation and the issues we're facing. There were recommendations of CRPD committee for Ukraine. Unfortunately, they are not being fulfilled. And we got the impression that perhaps international organizations or international agencies are unaware of them. We have lots of questions in Ukraine. Well, we see the standards are there, the standards recommendations are there, but somehow they're not implemented. Thank you very much. For the moment, that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Maybe I'm going to dive a bit deeper into that question, because the way in which it is formulated, it really shows, first of all, the importance of having proper resources to ensure that that partnership and that collaboration can meaningfully happen. But in resource-constrained context, when those resources are not there, what would be, according to you, ways of at least ensuring that there is a collaboration, and in which areas you think that such a collaboration could take place, keeping in mind the constraints, obviously, of not necessarily always having the right resources. Can I maybe turn to Sidiak to share your experience or your thoughts on this?
Ya, terima kasih.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So indeed, it becomes an issue when we have limited resources. Moreover, when it is a limited number of human resources that we are facing, it will be a major obstacle in implementing the program. This is considering that the baseline capacity of the PWDs pre-disaster or pre-crisis to be involved in humanitarian programs itself is already quite limited, especially with regards to the international organizations. So we find that there is oftentimes a gap. The standards in this case have been issued. To give you an example, we already have capacity standards that need to be met, and this is set at an international scale. but this is missing at the local level. So indeed, we need to take the lessons learned. That detailed assessment is very much needed. This would be crucial to ensure involvement. And there are several aspects that we need to give particular attention to. For example, the engagement process should ideally be done from the start of the project. And these capacities would also determine whether we can sufficiently implement the project or not. And we do have to admit that there is a timeline for projects. There is a certain period that we are dealing with. And proposals, in this case, also have allocations for funding, budgeting, and so on that becomes our constraint. However, we need to ensure that the parties are fully engaged. We need to ensure that we have the right approach. We need to ensure that we have intensive communication so that we can reach an agreement on how we can jointly implement the program by sufficiently involving the humanitarian organizations. And this is all from my side. And I would like to invite the other panelists here to complement to my explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sidiek. So Vitalia, do you have additional thoughts on this particular question that you want to share with us? Okay, I think Vitalia may have left the call. So okay, let's move on to the next one. There is a very important question about capacity strengthening and how we ensure that we have trained people at country level to provide capacity building, capacity strengthening, or trainings around disability inclusion to humanitarian actors. There is a question from Silva in DRC on how we can ensure that these resources and these trainings take place in different countries for this capacity strengthening to happen. So maybe can I turn to Amba, maybe from your experience within Bridge and the objectives that Bridge, particularly Article 11 that we are launching, and the trainings that you have mentioned will take place this this year. How can this enable both OPDs and humanitarian actors to take more responsibility in building capacity at country level?
Thank you for the question. I think that this is Bridge is a good model of when we talk about why people attend Bridge and what do we expect from participants of Bridge. One of the things is that Bridge is not, when participants attend Bridge and Module 3, whether they are humanitarians, whether they are OPDs, they do not pay for it. It is something which is fully, it's fully funded by the project. And the understanding is that you make a commitment to take the learnings forward. So the reason why we are organizing it, for example, where humanitarians and OPDs are from the countries together, is that they can go back and they can work to actually take the learnings forward. And it's really interesting because we've already received requests from networks in Nepal saying that they want to organize trainings to take it forward by humanitarians, to take it forward to other field workers. So it's all really interesting. And it's true that there's a lot of interest in OPDs to take work forward and in humanitarians to also take the work and the learnings forward. Sometimes what does present a barrier is funding. And I think somebody's just mentioned, Tayum has just mentioned that as well, is that there's no funding to take these workshops forward. We have, for example, we have, let's say, a deafblind facilitator, they need to be supported to take the learnings forward. And I think this ties in pretty well to the work that is happening with GLAD, on encouraging the kind of funding initiatives that actually work to building this capacity at the ground level. And what we're hoping is to show the impact of the Bridge Module 3 on the kind of initiatives that take place in these countries to build a case for why it's really important to make those investments to take it forward. But it's very true that, I mean, these are all parts of a continuum, and we can't have, which is what's great about this event in particular, that it's really looking at the entire chain. And it's something that we really need to consider. It's not that it's important that OPDs are part of these trainings, that OPDs are part of these processes because they bring the learnings forward. But I think it's also really important that we look at, okay, how can we really see, the ways in which we, how do I put it? Like how can we make sure that like the donors or even organizations which have capacity building budgets can actually take that to make those right investments to be inclusive of what the outcomes are that we seek to achieve. So I guess that's not like a very concrete answer, but maybe if we think about what the barriers are, it'll help all of us, especially in the discussions happening this year, to make that actually a ground reality. But to say that what we are doing from what I think projects like this particular one is doing is building a cadre of trained humanitarians and OPDs. But now the next step is how do we leverage that expertise to bring it to the grassroots level? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hamba. Yes, that's great. I'm mindful of the time, but I really want to ask this question and maybe ask Larissa and Sidiek in just 2 words to answer this one. It's a great question. Are larger humanitarian organizations resistant to the extra cost of including disabled people in terms of we can help more non-disabled people for the cost of helping one disabled person? So again, looking at quantity rather than being inclusive or considering the extra cost of being more inclusive. So any thoughts on this based on your experience? How humanitarian actors are looking at inclusion in this regard?
Ви знаєте, мені здається, що вони не проти, вони до кінця не розуміють.
I think that it's not that they resist, they don't understand what disability is as such. They think that they will manage without it. But in Ukraine, we see quite often that our issues of disability are dealt with the people who have no disability and tell us what to do. And we have to redo it afterwards. I gave you the examples when we're talking about the procurement of medical equipment, so medical accessibility. And we're talking about international players who are financing the refurbishment of the buildings, buying the equipment, who are providing various trainings and seminars. And of course, we would rather do the trainings on how to react, how to improve the humanitarian situation when we're talking about the people with disabilities. Indeed, the training should be done by the people with disability because they are here from the first days of war, and we understand very clearly what we need on the local level, what we need to do, how we need to do it, how we need to support our organizations, what we have to teach them. Otherwise, we can see that they won't survive because, what happened the first days of war? If we wouldn't have given them the knowledge, the tools, the support, many people wouldn't have survived because where are they going to? They're going to those who understand them, the organizations for people with disabilities. And that is a very important issue for Ukraine. You're absolutely right. That big players have to have the consultants with disability in their staff. And we always say that if you don't trust the Ukrainian experts, fine, then, international alliances of people with disabilities should send disabled people to their staff, but they have to work in international institutions because then it is easier to fight the barriers we have now. We can talk about it for a long time. We have got lots of examples about this. Thank you.
Yeah, Thank you very much, Larissa. Sorry, so I'm gonna leave it there due to time, but I think you've summarized very well. It's not resistance, it's maybe lack of knowledge, and that's where we need to work on. So Rosario, we'll leave it there.
Yes.
And over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian, for moderating this part, and thanks to our panelists for the responses. Now, I would like to invite Kirsten Lench, Disability Reference Group Co-Chair, to provide the key takeaways of this session. Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rosario. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think we've had an incredibly rich discussion today, and it's been such an amazing opportunity to learn from all of your experiences at country level. And I think today's event really highlighted to me the value in having the Disability Reference Group bringing together OPDs and humanitarian actors for these kind of exchanges where we can all learn from each other. So to try and to have the very ambitious task of summarizing today's discussion, I mean, we started off today hearing from Philemon that commitments have been made at a system-wide level to strengthening localization, and that includes to strengthening leadership of local OPDs. So these commitments have been made, but now we need to work to operationalize them. And we heard today that there are already many good practices and many experiences that we can learn from to do this. One of the key messages that we started off with today with the intervention from Karen from USAID, and I think this was a thread that continued to run throughout many of the interventions, was that what we need is a shift in power. We need to move away from business as usual in terms of how humanitarian action is planned and delivered. Concretely, what I heard as some of the key takeaways, some of the key points that we need to be addressing. One is the need to ensure that there is a common understanding of the mandate and the role of OPDs, as opposed to, for example, the role and mandate of service providers. There's also a need to ensure accessibility of information and partnership processes, and recognizing that this does require some investment and needs to be budgeted for. There was also a lot of mention today around the need for improving access to funding for local OPDs and overcoming a lot of the challenges that we're still seeing to that. We also heard multiple times about the importance of capacity sharing. So that includes institutional capacity strengthening for OPDs, as well as capacity building for humanitarian actors on accessibility and inclusion. And again, that this capacity sharing does require some commitment and investment. We also heard, I thought, an interesting point that preparedness actions are a key entry point for strengthening OPD leadership and participation. So ensuring that we're putting these partnerships in place even before the start of an emergency. So I realize we're just 1 minute short of time. I don't want to take up any more time than that, but just once again to thank all the participants for your support to this event. Back to you, Rosario.
Okay, thank you so much. We are now closing this event. I would like to thank first our great panelists today. Also, I would like to thank our service providers who make possible to have the accessibility. I'd like to thank the Disability Reference Group for organizing this event, and to all the participants who have attended this event. Thanks so much, and we can see you next time. Okay. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Rosario.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.